Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to leave the shadows. In a dusty glass jar, deep inside Cornell University, rests the severed brain of a man who embodied both brilliance and blood. 8. It stares back at us through the fog of formaldehyde, as if mocking history itself, daring us to understand how one of the most gifted minds of the 19th century could also be one of its most monstrous killers. His name was Edward Howard Rulloff, remembered by newspapers as the genius killer. He was a man who could speak 8 languages, translate ancient Greek with precision, and construct theories about human consciousness so advanced they bordered on prophetic. And yet that same intelligence became the engine of savagery, feeding obsessions so dangerous that the soil of New York still whispers with the memory of his crimes. This is not the tale of an ordinary murderer. Story of a man who weaponized intellect itself, hiding his appetite for control and domination beneath the polished veneer of scholarship. He lectured on science by day and planned the destruction of lives by night. He played the role of teacher, doctor, philosopher, and family man, but, in truth, every title was camouflage. Every gesture of respectability was a mask stretched over something darker, something that did not just kill, but corrupted. This is why his brain was preserved, not as a curiosity, but as a warning. Because when genius is left unchecked by morality, it transforms into a force more terrifying than brute violence, a predator cloaked in enlightenment. But before we descend into his double life, I want you to pause, because once you step into this rabbit hole, there's no turning back. What you're about to learn is not just history, it's forbidden knowledge. The kind of story that rewires how you see the line between intelligence and evil. If you're ready to know what the authorities, the scholars, and the pious alike could never reconcile, then lean in. And while we're just beginning, do one thing right now to prove you're with me on this descent. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe, because tonight, you and I are not just telling a story. We are unmasking a system of lies that has kept you blind to the most dangerous truth of all, that brilliance itself can be a weapon of destruction. Every monster begins as a child. But Edward Rulloff was not born into darkness. He learned it one choice at a time, shaping his mind into a weapon sharper than any blade. Born around 1820 in New Brunswick, Canada, he was a boy of contradictions. Frail in body, yet towering in intellect. While other children played in fields, Edward devoured books like a starving man at a feast. Greek, botany, medicine. He absorbed knowledge at a rate that astonished his teachers. They whispered he was destined for greatness, perhaps even immortality, through the ideas he carried. But what no one realized was this: knowledge in Edward's hands was never about truth. It was about power. From his earliest years, his brilliance was already fused with corruption. At the dry goods store where he worked as a teenager, fires mysteriously broke out. Flames erased inventory records, just as missing goods appeared in Edward's possession. Coincidence? Hardly. And caught, he smirked at the accusation, as though the trial itself was beneath his mind. Convicted of theft and arson, he was sent to prison. But instead of reform, prison became his academy of shadows. Behind the bars, he refined not just his learning, but his patience, his manipulation, his ability to wear the mask of virtue while cultivating the mind of a predator. And when he emerged, he was not the same boy who had entered. He shed his birth name, Howard Rulloffson, and reinvented himself as Edward Rulloff, name chosen not just for its sophistication, but as a declaration. The man who left prison would never again be small, never again be powerless. He would carve his place among the great men of history, even if it meant building that legacy upon blood. He lectured on phrenology, quoted the ancients, debated politics, and spoke with the confidence of one born to command. Farmers, clergymen, merchants, people starved for knowledge drank in his words. They believed they had found a rare treasure, a mind sent by Providence, but they were wrong. What they welcomed into their homes was not a savior, but a serpent. 'Cause here's the truth, no one tells you. The most dangerous predators don't look like monsters. They look like teachers. They look like doctors. They look like men who carry books, not knives. And that was Rulloff's genius, not only to learn, but to manipulate. Not only to study the human mind, but to control it. This was the beginning of his double life, the life of a scholar and the life of a killer in waiting. The year was 1842, and central New York was buzzing with transformation. The Erie Canal had cracked open sleepy towns, spilling in trade, wealth, and the promise of progress. In the village of Dryden, east of Ithaca, hope itself hung in the air. The people wanted growth. They wanted enlightenment. They wanted a man of knowledge to lift them above the mud of rural life. And Edward Rulloff walked in at the perfect moment, tall, confident, his black hair neatly groomed, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. To the farmers and townsfolk, he seemed a gift from Providence. He quoted, "Poetry in the original Greek, prescribed botanical remedies with the precision of a physician, and delivered lectures on the fashionable pseudoscience of phrenology that left crowds spellbound. He could debate politics, discuss the mysteries of language, and even dabble in photography and carpentry. Whatever topic you placed before him, Rulloff turned into a stage for his brilliance. To the villagers, he wasn't just smart, he was a bridge to a larger, brighter world, and he knew it. He thrived on their awe, feeding it, bending it, using it as fuel. Because Rulloff did not just want respect, he wanted control. The admiration of Dryden was not enough. He wanted to own it. Farmers consulted him about their crops. Politicians sought his advice. Families invited him into their homes as if welcoming a prophet. In a matter of months, he was offered the position of headmaster at the local school, placing him in the role of shaping young minds, molding futures. Among those minds was one that would change his story forever: Harriet Shutt, the 17-year-old daughter of a prominent family. She was everything the era prized: educated, refined, beautiful, with light brown hair and hazel eyes that carried both intelligence and innocence. To her, Rulloff represented the exotic sophistication of a world far beyond rural New York. And to him, Harriet was not merely a wife-to-be, she was proof that he could claim not only the town's respect, but its most prized possession. Their attraction was immediate, almost feverish. The villagers gossiped about how lucky Harriet was to have caught such a brilliant man. But beneath the whispers of admiration lurked unspoken doubts. Some had seen flashes of his temper, jealousy that burned too hot, anger that seemed to rise from nowhere, yet they dismissed it. After all, how could a man so educated, so charming, so intellectually divine also be dangerous? That is the mistake communities make. They confuse brilliance with goodness, intellect with virtue. But Edward Rulloff was not their savior. He was their ruin in disguise. And when Harriet's family welcomed him into their lives, they did not realize they were opening their door to a man who would turn knowledge into a weapon and love into a curse. On December 31st, 1843, as snow buried the Finger Lakes in silence, Edward Rulloff stood before a minister and swore his vows to Harriet Shutt. To the people of Dryden, it was the union of brilliance and beauty, a marriage that promised to elevate both families into something greater. The ceremony was simple, well attended, and seemed the kind of storybook beginning a small town dreams about. But even on that sacred day, the cracks in Rulloff's mask of civility split open for anyone who cared to look. When the minister, following custom, congratulated the bride with a gentle kiss on the cheek, Edward's face darkened with an intensity that froze the room. His eyes burned with a sudden fury so sharp that several guests instinctively recoiled. What should have been a passing moment of warmth became a glimpse of something else. Something raw, primal, and terrifying. The laughter returned, the dancing resumed, But beneath the music lingered an unease. Harriet herself felt it more than anyone, a chill that told her this was not mere passion. It was possession. The honeymoon was brief, more storm than tenderness. Rulloff's love oscillated between suffocating devotion and volcanic rage. He moved Harriet away from her family under the pretense of building their new life. But the truth was simpler, darker: isolation. In Lansing, he set up a practice as a botanical physician, healing neighbors with herbs and gaining praise as a man of medicine. His reputation grew, and his home filled with books, lectures, and lofty theories about the evolution of human language. Outwardly, he was a healer and a scholar. Inwardly, he was a jailer. Harriet's new world was a prison built from charm and intellect, with bars made of jealousy and fear. The birth of their daughter, Priscilla, in 1845, brought a fleeting calm. For a short time, Edward appeared tender, even doting. He read to his wife, cradled his child, and spoke of a grand future where his genius would finally be recognized. He dreamed aloud of Ohio, of professorships, of a destiny beyond the small-minded gossip of New York towns. But Harriet's family remained close, and with them, so did Rulloff's paranoia. It was Dr. Henry Bull, Harriet's cousin, and Edward's business partner, who became the focus of his obsessions. Bull's easy familiarity, his affectionate gestures as a family member, were enough to ignite Edward's volcanic jealousy. He convinced himself Harriet was unfaithful, poisoned by those who despised his brilliance. And in this poisonous belief, the mask of the scholar began to slip entirely. Because what Rulloff could not bear was the one truth his intellect refused to conquer, that no matter how much knowledge he possessed, he could not control the human heart. And so, he would break it the only way he knew, through fear, domination, and eventually, blood. By the spring of 1845, Edward Rulloff's world had become a pressure cooker. On the surface, he was the respected physician scholar, treating the sick with his herbal remedies and charming townsfolk with lectures on the mysteries of language. But behind closed doors, he was a storm tightening around Harriet. His jealousy had metastasized into obsession. Every glance she gave, every word she spoke to another man became proof in his mind of betrayal. And the figure who haunted him most was Dr. Henry Bull, too. Edward. Bull wasn't just a cousin-in-law or a business partner. He was a rival, a phantom enemy feeding Harriet lies and plotting to strip Rulloff of the control he demanded. It was during this season of mounting paranoia that tragedy struck Harriet's family. Her sister Rena, having just given birth, fell gravely ill along with the newborn. The family, desperate, turned to Edward. After all, wasn't he the celebrated healer? Didn't he hold knowledge beyond their reach? Edward prepared an herbal treatment himself, administering it with a calm that seemed rehearsed. But within 48 hours, both mother and child were dead. In the 19th century, death was no stranger to childbirth. Families buried infants as often as they baptized them. And yet the timing, the coldness in Edward's response, the veiled comment he made afterward, who might go next, stirred something darker in those who knew him. Whispers spread like wildfire. Is he truly a healer or a predator cloaked in science? Did his remedies cure, kill? The Shutt family began to see through the cracks. Their doubts hardened into suspicion, their warmth into hostility. And to Edward, that shift was intolerable. He was not a man who accepted opposition. He saw himself as destined, chosen, elevated above the petty judgments of ordinary men. To be questioned was to be insulted. To be doubted was to be betrayed. Harriet, caught between the family that raised her and the husband who imprisoned her, became the battleground. Edward's arguments grew violent, his accusations more deranged. He spoke endlessly of Ohio, of escape, of fleeing this town of small minds that could never recognize his brilliance. But Harriet resisted. Her grief for her lost relatives bound her to her family, and her refusal only deepened Edward's fury. The air in their home grew heavier with each passing day, thick with unspoken dread, sharp with the promise of disaster. Edward's rage simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the spark that would ignite the inferno. And in June of 1844, with thunder rolling across Cayuga Lake, the storm finally broke. What followed was not a quarrel. It was not even a crime of passion. It was the cold, deliberate shattering of a family by a man whose genius had rotted into madness. June 22nd, 1844. A summer thunderstorm rolled over Cayuga Lake. Lightning tearing through the sky as if the heavens themselves wanted to illuminate what was about to happen inside the small Lansing home of Edward and Harriet Rulloff. The argument began like so many others, Edward demanding Harriet leave her family and follow him to Ohio. Harriet refusing, her voice tired from months of resistance. But this time, there would be no reconciliation, no fragile truce. This time, the storm. Outside would be mirrored within. Edward had been drinking his temper sharper, his suspicions boiling. He hurled accusations of infidelity, naming Harriet's cousin, Dr. Henry Bull, as her secret lover. Harriet, exhausted, laughed bitterly at the absurdity. That laugh cut him deeper than any confession could have. To Edward, it was mockery, betrayal, humiliation. In that instant, his brilliance meant nothing. His scholarship, his charm, his intellect, tall, dissolved into raw violence. Harriet was in the kitchen, crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle. Edward lunged. With a snarl, he ripped the pestle from her hands and swung it down with devastating force. The blow cracked against her forehead, dropping her instantly to the floor. Blood spread across the wood as lightning flashed through the windows, framing Edward's shadow over her body. He stood there, not horrified, not repentant, but coldly satisfied. She would never defy him again. Then came the sound that shattered whatever humanity remained in him, the cry of their infant daughter, Priscilla. Woken by the noise, she wailed from her cradles, small, helpless, innocent. To Edward, that sound was not grief. It was a threat, a witness, a future that could turn against him. In a decision that revealed the full abyss of his soul, he silenced her cries forever. The storm outside raged, but inside the house it was silent except for Edward's breathing. He had crossed the final threshold. No longer was he the respected healer, the gifted teacher, the brilliant scholar. He was now something stripped bare, a killer who believed his genius placed him above consequence, above morality, above God himself. When neighbors later noticed Harriet and the child missing, Edward would weave lies, claim Harriet had fled, that she was unstable, that he was the victim of abandonment. And many believed him, because here's the darkest truth. The most dangerous monsters are not those you fear in the woods. They are the ones who sit at your dinner table, who teach your children, who heal your six-miling as they bury their sins beneath a mask of intellect. That night, Edward Rulloff didn't just murder his wife and child, he murdered the illusion. That genius is inherently good. And in doing so, he became something far worse than an ordinary killer. He became a man who proved that intellect, without conscience, is the most lethal weapon ever forged. Morning broke over Lansing. The storm washed clean from the sky. But inside the Rulloff household, silence hung heavy, a silence that hid unspeakable violence. Harriet and Priscilla were going to vanish, Edward claimed, neighbors who asked. He spun a tale with the calm authority of a scholar rehearsing a lecture. Harriet, he said, had abandoned him. She had grown unstable, he whispered. Perhaps she had run away with another man. Perhaps she had fled the burdens of family life. To those who doubted, he painted himself as the injured husband, wronged. Heartbroken, yet stoic in his suffering, they believed him. Because how could they not? This was Edward Rulloff, the learned physician, the linguist, the teacher. The man whose brilliance made lesser minds tremble. He spoke with the confidence of intellect, and in the 19th century, confidence was as good as evidence. Women who ran away were not uncommon. A man abandoned by a wife was pitiable, not suspicious. The absence of bodies gave his story air to breathe, and Edward knew exactly how to feed it. But Harriet's family was not so easily deceived. They felt the fracture, the wrongness beneath his words. Harriet loved her family too deeply to disappear without a trace. Priscilla was too young to survive without her. And Edward's coldness, in the face of their grief, was not the wound of a broken man, it was the arrogance of someone convinced he had triumphed. Still, suspicion was not proof. Without bodies, without confession, their doubts fell into the void. Edward walked freely, his reputation intact, his secrets buried, perhaps quite literally in places no one would ever find. Yet something had shifted. To live with murder is to live with shadows, and Edward's life became a theater of masks. He doubled down on his scholarship, throwing himself into grandiose linguistic theories, writing as if to prove his mind was untouchable. He lectured louder, dazzled more forcefully, convinced himself that his brilliance insulated him from consequence. But beneath it all, paranoia festered. He watched the Shutt family with calculating eyes, always gauging whether they were whispering too loudly, always ready to twist truth into lies if the past threatened to surface. This was the beginning of Edward Rulloff's true double life, not just the scholar and the murderer, but the creator and the destroyer. Every idea he spoke in public, every theory he penned, was balanced on a foundation of blood. Every word he uttered carried the silent weight of Harriet and Priscilla, whose voices had been silenced so that his might rise louder. And here lies the forbidden truth. Sometimes the most enduring legacies are built not on what men create, but on what they destroy. Rulloff had erased his family, and in their absence, constructed a myth of a man too brilliant to be evil. But myths are fragile, and sooner or later, the truth claws its way back to the surface. For a time, Edward Rulloff walked untouched. Harriet and Priscilla reduced to whispers, their absence explained away by his carefully spun lies. But freedom did not bring him peace. It brought him hunger. It silenced the only two people who could truly defy him, and in doing so, he had discovered something intoxicating: the power of erasure. If someone opposed him, if someone threatened his sense of genius, he could simply remove them. His scholarly pursuits became more fevered, more obsessive. He poured himself into a sprawling, unfinished manuscript on the origins of language, work he believed would change human understanding forever. He ranted about the grand system that only he, in his brilliance, could uncover. To outsiders, it looked like genius at work. But to those who lived near him, who saw his wild eyes and manic pace, it looked like madness cloaked in ink. And yet intellect alone could not sustain him. Edward began dabbling in darker enterprises. He fell in with petty thieves, men who saw in him not a scholar but a strategist. They became his accomplices, his tools. To them, he was a mastermind planning burglaries, teaching them how to evade suspicion, using his charisma to command loyalty. To him, they were expendable pawns. This was the paradox of Rulloff, a man who dreamed of reshaping language, of being remembered among the greatest minds of history, yet who spent his nights plotting burglaries and his days defrauding those who trusted him. His crimes were not just about money, they were about dominance. Each deception, each theft, was a reminder that he could outthink the world. But the cracks were showing. Rumors spread in Dryden and beyond, about Harriet, about the child, about Edward's chilling indifference. Some whispered he had killed them, though no one could prove it. Others noticed his control over his accomplices, how men around him seemed to vanish or meet misfortune. Suspicion followed him like a shadow, growing darker, heavier, closer. Still, Edward thrived on it. He seemed to relish the danger, as if taunting fate. In his mind, he was untouchable, protected by his intellect, justified by his brilliance. If he could write the book that explained the origins of human thought, who would dare hold him accountable for the small matters of missing women, vanished children, or stolen goods? But history has a way of catching up, even to men who believe. They are beyond it. And soon, Edward's dual life, the scholar and the criminal, would collide violently, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a community no longer willing to look the other way. Because genius may dazzle for a time, but blood has a longer memory. By the late 1840s, Edward Rulloff had transformed from scholar-physician into something far stranger, a criminal mastermind hiding behind the guise of genius. His home, once a place of books and lectures, became a meeting ground for thieves and rogues who looked to him for leadership. Where they had desperation, he had strategy. Where they had brute force, he had cunning. Together, they became a shadowy band of burglars, slipping through farmhouses and stores in the dead of night. To his followers, Edward was almost mythical. He planned every detail, the routes, the signals, the alibis. He lectured them as if crime were a science, each burglary a case study in human weakness. He would tell them that burglary, like language, had a structure that those too simple-minded to understand deserved to be exploited. They called him the brains of the outfit, and in that title, Edward found a twisted kind of validation. But loyalty to Rulloff was dangerous. His partners began to vanish. One was last seen on a job with Edward and was never heard from again. Another quarreled with him over stolen goods and soon disappeared without explanation, neighbors whispered. Had they fled? Had they been arrested? Or had Edward, as some suspected, silenced them the way he had silenced his wife and child? No bodies ever surfaced, but the pattern was too sharp to ignore. Where Edward Rulloff walked, people tended to vanish. Still, he always slipped the noose. When questioned, he responded with eloquence, weaving elaborate defenses that left accusers bewildered. His calm demeanor, his command of language, and his reputation for brilliance acted as armor. He wasn't a common thief. He insisted he was a man misunderstood by those too small to grasp his genius, and astonishingly, many believed him. Cracks were forming. His gang began to fear him as much as they admired him. Was he their leader or their executioner? His paranoia grew sharper, his temper more violent, spoke often of betrayal, of enemies conspiring against him. Every ally became a potential threat, every whisper an accusation. It was here, in the late nights of plotting burglaries and the quiet mornings of writing his great linguistic manuscript, that Edward Rulloff became fully to men, one who dreamed of reshaping human knowledge, and one who lived off the blood and fear of others. Those two selves were beginning to collide, because sooner or later, even the sharpest mind cannot keep murder hidden forever. And Edward Rulloff's brilliance was leading him, step by step, into the kind of crime that no lie, no book, and no intellect could ever erase. For years, Edward Rulloff danced at the edge of suspicion, his intellect shielding him from the gallows. But by the 1850s, his luck began to thin. Too many whispers surrounded him. Too many men had vanished in his company, and the Shutt family never stopped hinting that Harriet and little Priscilla had not run away at all. The mask of the misunderstood genius was cracking. It started with theft. Rulloff's burglaries had grown bolder, his gang more notorious. One night, after a string of robberies gone wrong, authorities finally caught up with him. Edward was dragged before a judge not as a brilliant scholar, but as a common criminal. Yet even in shackles, his tongue was sharp. He spoke with such eloquence, such command of language, that some jurors doubted whether a man of his refinement could truly be guilty of vulgar theft. He cast himself as a victim of circumstance, a great mind reduced to crime only because society had failed to recognize his genius. But this time, not everyone was convinced. The Shutts pressed harder. They demanded to know where Harriet was, where Priscilla had gone. Edward dodged, deflected, painted Harriet as unstable. But their persistence left a shadow over the courtroom. And though no bodies had ever been found, the suspicion of murder clung to him like smoke. Still, the law was limited. Without evidence of the killings, without the corpses, prosecutors focused on what they could prove: burglary. Rulloff was sentenced to Sing Sing prison. For many men, that might have been the end. But for Edward, prison became another stage. He argued with guards and wardens as if they were students. He lectured fellow inmates on linguistics, convinced that even in chains, his mind was untouchable. His manuscript grew, page by page, a grand theory of language that he swore would one day prove his immortality. Outside the prison walls, his name spread. To some, he was a cautionary tale, the learned doctor who turned criminal. To others, he was a dark fascination, a genius whose intellect seemed almost supernatural, even as his life reeked of violence. Writers and scholars began whispering about him, not with admiration, but with morbid curiosity. Was Edward Rulloff a misunderstood thinker or a monster hiding behind words? When he was released years later, the world had changed, but Edward had not. If anything, prison had deepened his arrogance. He emerged still convinced of his destiny, still clutching at the manuscript he believed would redeem him. But freedom also meant temptation, and the man who had murdered his wife and child, who had betrayed his friends and manipulated his neighbors, could not resist the thrill of crime. And so, Edward Rulloff stepped back into society, half scholar, half criminal, entirely dangerous. The law had caught him once. The question was not if it would catch him again, but how many more lives he would destroy before it did.